Hi, everybody. I am John Burke of Burke and Company, and I am excited. This is a first-time event. We are doing a Q&A here. And on today's topic, what we're doing a Q&A on, bear with me. I haven't done this before. There's a lot to be watching. I've been on Facebook Live, but I haven't tried to juggle all this while I was on Facebook Live before. So what today we're going to be doing this on is it's gotten a lot of attention, the Seattle City current affordable housing plan. So just to give you a little insight of who I am, I'm John Burke. I have a real estate team at the Long and Foster Seattle City office, formerly the NJ Realty office in Seattle City. My team is comprised of Dave Sedlak, Chris McGurk, and Justine Harkins, as well as myself. My parents live in Seattle. I do not live in Seattle. My house is out in Cape May Courthouse. That's actually where I'm from right now, talking to you. But my parents actually do live in Seattle on 44th Street. They attempted to retire there, but they keep working. So I do, I have a vested interest in the town, and where they are on the 100 block of 44th Street is definitely impacted by this legislation and what's going on. I also think, although, we're sort of a short family, I've spent my whole life in this area, especially during the summer, before I got into real estate as an adult here. I also am not necessarily tied in with a lot of the same entities in Seattle that often sort of go hand in hand. So I can be very skeptical of the town sometimes. And I'm not one of those people who's just going to sort of drink the Kool-Aid and then try to pass the Kool-Aid on to the next person. So with that, let's tackle this topic. I want to give you some background information to begin. Some people might know this, some people might not know where this all comes from. So the letter that went out is actually related to a doctrine called the Mount Laurel Doctrine that goes all the way back to 1975. And it's not a piece of legislation. It was an interpretation by a judge of the New Jersey Constitution that basically said all municipalities had a requirement to provide an opportunity for low-income housing inside the municipality. And the interpretation of this has been litigated and tried and trouble for decades now in New Jersey. And one of the biggest pieces that came out of it, a few big pieces, one was the formation of a board, a government board called the Coalition on Affordable Housing, that for a long time was sort of the mediator in a lot of this issue. It's actually now gone, it's defunct. But additionally, there's a nonprofit called the Fair Share Housing Center that has been behind almost all the litigation involved in this Mount Laurel Doctrine. All right, the Mount Laurel Doctrine, what it set up, probably the most controversial piece of it is something called the Builder's Remedy. And what the Builder's Remedy is basically because of this interpretation of the Constitution of New Jersey, it's provided a precedent whereby a builder or developer can approach a municipality with a plan to develop that would break the zoning in some way. So they'd go above and beyond or outside the zoning that currently exists inside the municipality. And since they're told they're not able to do it, they then sue the town and have a judge step in, and the judge then says to the town, well, you have to do it because you don't have a plan in place for affordable housing. And therefore, in order to keep you in line with the Mount Laurel Doctrine and your requirement to provide an opportunity for low-income housing, we're going to overrule your zoning and let this developer do what he wants to do. So there have been some cases where developers have gone in and built 10-story buildings in places that you never thought you were going to see a 10-story building. So the state did get involved. The legislature got involved. And what they basically put into place, there is some legislation involved. And what it said was that, towns should have a process whereby they can meet their obligation to provide reasonable opportunities. So that municipalities should have a chance to preempt this, to prevent this from happening. And the way to do that is to get, it turns out, both the state and this very important nonprofit called the Fair Share Housing Center to sign off on a plan that you then implement. So you have to have zoning in your town that provides an opportunity, not the actual housing, but an opportunity, a reasonable opportunity for affordable housing to be built. And then you need both the state and this Fair Share Housing Center to sign off on it. And that brings us to where we are today. Because this was not an issue during most of the Christie administration. It wasn't at the top of his list as a priority, and most municipalities were able to ignore it. However, it started to become an issue again, And Seattle City decided they better be proactive. So in 2015, they began negotiating with the state and the Fair Share Housing Center to try to put together a plan that would satisfy those two entities so that they wouldn't have to worry about a builder showing up further down the road and basically overruling their zoning and doing whatever they wanted to do in order to provide affordable housing. And that brings you to the three ordinances that a lot of people in town received a letter about recently. Ordinance 1626, 1627, and 1628. And I was at the town council meeting this morning. I've spoken to several people. I am not a lawyer. I am just, another citizen who's reporting to you on my understanding of things. But basically, it provides three, and then another little item that I'll mention, changes to current Seattle City zoning. One, pre-existing houses can, if they'd like to, rezone themselves with the deed restriction as low-income housing. So if you owned a triplex, you could go and redeed yourself as low-income housing. I don't know why somebody would opt to do that, but you can do that to a pre-existing home. And if you do that, the town will incentivize people doing that by giving them $10,000. Where does this money come from? Good question. Basically, up until now, anytime commercial development has been done in Seattle, in order to comply with some things the city was trying to do before to satisfy this with the state, there's been a 2.5% fee put on the developers, not for the entire building, just for the commercial space. And it's assessed at a very low rate, usually around like $45 per square foot, the construction cost of the commercial space. And that 2.5% fee has been going to the state. By being in compliance, that will no longer have to go to the state, and that money will be used to fund this. However, the city does not anticipate that any money will be available for a very long time. As a matter of fact, it will probably be 2045 before they'd be able to make the first two payments of this $10,000. So people are welcome to do it, and they would be ultimately entitled to the money, at least that's what it sounded like to me, but the city's not required to pay them the money until the money is actually in the trust fund, and it would take approximately 20 years for that money to get there, just for the first two people. So I can't really see any incentive to pre-existing property going and doing that. The second area of the ordinances, it created a couple age-restricted zones. Those are areas that are going to be designated for affordable housing, but a specific type of affordable housing. Age-restricted, I think there's actually a federal guideline that the state uses, and it's for 55 plus people. They'd be mandated they could only be 2-bedroom units. Each unit could only be 2 bedrooms, 55 plus. And those areas are, the town decided to zone without consultation with them, but they decided to zone areas that were owned by religious entities. So we're talking about the St. Joe's parking lot and the old St. Joe's elementary school, as well as a little bit of the property further in from that, more towards the beach on 44th and 45th, on Central between 44th and 45th. And also the property, nuns, the nuns own some property. It used to be a hospital back in the day, actually, but the nuns own a piece, some nuns own a piece of property on 59th and Landis. So those two areas have been zoned for this age-restricted housing. That's probably the biggest wild card in all this, and I will come back to that at the end. The third, and the reason so many of these letters went out, and so many people showed up at the council meeting today, and so many people are concerned in Seattle, is the creation of these overlay zones. These overlay zones, it's important to understand that in these so-called new overlay zones, they're taking existing areas, zoned, some of it zoned residential, some of it zoned C3, some of it zoned C2, so different commercial zones. They're taking some of those areas, and in those areas, absolutely nothing whatsoever is required to be done by anybody, not by anybody who owns the land. There's no grandfathering here, so it's not special rules for the people who own it, and when they sell it, it's going to be new rules. There's nothing required. There's no change to what you must do in any of these zones. So all of your rights to do what you were allowed to do before, if you're in an R2 zone that's now in this overlay zone, R2 zones are where they build the townhouses, the side-by-side townhouses. You will still be allowed to build those, right? And I would imagine most people will opt to build those if they're going to develop on those. If you're in the commercial zones, where they've been doing 2 commercial units and then 4 residential on top, you will still be able to do that. So nothing there is required of anybody. They're also, and this is something that I didn't understand, and I spoke to a few people early on when I was investigating this, and I misunderstood. So this might come as a correction to a few people. There is no change in what they call the D zoning or the dimension zoning. or sometimes they refer to it as the bulk zoning. And that means the size of the property, the setbacks from the property lines, as well as the height of the building and the dimensions that you're allowed to use on the property, and the parking requirements. So for every unit, you need a parking spot. Those will not change either. Okay, so it'll all be the same size. However, if you own in those overlay zones, or you buy in those overlay zones, or you're developing in those overlay zones, you will have an option, all right? And this is to satisfy the state that if you want to add an additional low income unit, right, deed restricted, low income, you will not make much money selling that. You will not make much money renting that. But if you want to do that, you will be entitled to building another unit. So where you could only build 4 units before, you can now build 5, plus 1 low income unit. It sounds like that's more development, but it's not, because the bulk size remains the same. So it'll still be the same size structure. You'd have to figure out a way to configure more units inside it, and you still have to provide the additional parking spots for the 2 units that you're introducing. So it sort of says to the state, look, we're doing our part here. We're trying to come up with a reason that somebody would want to do this. We're giving them a chance to build a whole extra unit. But I can't see a reason that anybody would opt to go and do that. I don't see a financial reason anyone would opt to do that. All right, and finally, this is sort of a 4th thing, set-aside variances. Set-aside variances are when you go, there's a lot of different ways people talk about it. Sometimes they say if you're being a pig, right? Supposedly in CIL is an issue for a long time where developers, people have sort of been pigs. Everything's been bigger and bigger and bigger. And supposedly right now there's been a lot of pushback on that, right? Like we want to keep things smaller now as much as we can and try to control some of this. But if you do have a compelling reason that you think you should be given a zoning variance, you can approach the board for a zoning variance where, suppose you have commercial 5,000 square feet, right? C3 or C2, I forget which is which, but you're allowed to do the 2 commercial with the 4 residential on top. And there's some reason you think you should be allowed to do a 5th, right? So you're going and asking, well, actually in this case, you'd be able to, if you're in the overlay zone, so say you're not in the overlay zone, okay? In the overlay zone, you could go and try to, but suppose you were not in the overlay zone and now you're going to go and ask for a variance. If the city decides to give anybody a variance, right? And it involves more than 5 units, because the city also thought of a little loophole they were worried about. But if the development or the project involves more than 5 or more units, and you go to get a variance, so you're trying to do something bigger than you should have been allowed to do, you're going to have to take low-income housing into consideration. And you're going to have to set aside 20% of the housing that you build there for that. So in some ways, these ordinances will probably end up being anti-variance. We'll probably see fewer variances in CIL as a direct result of these ordinances going into effect. If you're in the overlay zone, you could have gone and done that, but outside the overlay zone, you would have needed the variance. It's probably less likely that people would both seek or get these variances at that point. All right, if you are interested, I've done a little bit of research. It's very confusing. I don't have a great short explanation of who or what will qualify for low-income housing. It depends upon the region that you're in. We're in region 6 in the state. It depends upon the average home cost, what counts, or what you're allowed to price it at, rather, and additionally, the average income for what income level you need to be at in order to qualify for it. But what does this all mean? All right, the big thing is the city avoids judges making this decision for them, because that was the alternative. So this plan is really being put in place not because CIL, had a strong desire as an entity itself to create a plan for affordable housing, but because it realized that if it didn't have a plan in place approved by the state, it ran the risk of a judge showing up who does not live here, who does not own here, and who has no interest in the well-being of the town, making a decision for us. And other than that, I don't think a lot changes. I kind of just laid out some of the reasons. When you look at pre-existing properties, I cannot see why anybody would deed restrict their property just to pick up $10,000 that they won't get for 20 years. It would be foolish to go and do. So I can't see pre-existing property owners deciding to do that. They did come up, when I mentioned before, if you needed to get a zoning variance for something, it would only kick in if you were doing a big project, like over 5. So if you needed it because you had like a pre-existing triplex, and it was non-conforming, but you'd had it grandfathered in, you needed a variance to do something that the city would probably let you do, it won't affect you there either, so no low-income housing kicks in there. The area at the public school, the old public school. So now we're moving up central towards between like 45th and 46th Streets. That's not affected by this at all. So there's not going to be any low-income developed housing there, which a lot of people are worried about. The only areas that, in my opinion, I think are wild cards that you might see something occur just because it's difficult to predict are the age-restricted areas that they created specifically because it helped them negotiate with this committee in both 44th, 45th Street and up at 59th Street. They're owned by religious entities, and it is impossible to predict where they might be in the future or what they might decide to do. Of course, if they decided to sell, there's no requirement that the new owner would have to do housing like this. But religious entities might decide to sell charitable organizations that might have a motive to do it. So if I do think there's a wild card, I don't think it's anytime soon. I can't see that church giving up that parking lot. I'm not a good practicing Catholic, but I was raised Catholic. I know a lot of people go to that church, and I cannot see that church giving up that parking lot. What the nuns own on 59th, I don't know. I guess that's a little bit more questionable. That's the area that maybe something age-restricted, 55 plus, two-bedroom communities could occur. And also, the town seems to be providing in this ordinance the option to sort of redesign the bulk zoning there to accommodate it. So those might be the places you could see something far down the road. Maybe never, but that would be the spot that something might occur. So, who are the winners and losers here? I think the big winners are property owners. This raised a lot of eyebrows. It raised eyebrows for me. I mean, I don't own property in Sea Isle, but I mean, my parents do, and I know a lot of people. I've worked for a lot of people, and I make a living selling property in this town. It's a good market. I'm happy to sell property here. I wouldn't like for it not to be a good market, or all the people that I've sold property to. For something like that to occur to them. So I think this is good for property owners because the other winner here, I think, is, the city of Sea Isle and the government of Sea Isle, because well, not for once, I don't want to be like that, but they have their act together on this. They're basically nipping this in the bud before somebody else is able to use it against them. And they're enacting a plan that controls this as much as possible. As the mayor put it, and the city council, and the mayor didn't speak, but somebody on the city council mentioned it. You have to read what they're saying here because they have obligations to speak a certain way. And we want to be fair, right? And create this reasonable opportunity. We want that. But we also want to be fair to the members of our community that live here already and that own property here already. And that we need to also protect the value of their home. So we need to balance those two. And this plan does a pretty good job of balancing those interests. All right, so who are the losers here? One, people, and I know there's some people who saw this event and thought it was a big opportunity. People thinking that Sea Isle is suddenly going to be flush in affordable housing that they can rush in and buy. I am sorry to disappoint you. I do not see that happening. I don't see it happening. Most people probably would not qualify anyway. I kind of looked into the details about how you would qualify. A lot of people, I think, who would be interested in homes wouldn't necessarily qualify for it anyway. But there's not going to be a ton of cheap houses available in Sea Isle. Another big loser here, which doesn't often happen in Sea Isle, is I don't think this is a great ordinance for developers. They don't get, not so much that they get anything taken away here, but for once, there's no handout in it to them. There's nothing here that makes it easier or bigger or more for them to go and do. In a lot of ways, I really see this as reining in some of the things that have been going on. So for once, Sea Isle, it doesn't seem to be trying to hand something out to developers. And I guess the other loser, if there is one here, are people who own in these new overlay zones. Not because I think it's going to affect their property value. I don't think, that's my honest gut opinion, that I don't think for a few reasons. But if there is somebody who is being unfairly burdened by this, it's the people whose zoning was changed on them. So even though I don't think it will affect them, it's certainly not a good thing. If I had to choose between it, being changed on my house or not changed on my house, that would be the spot that, I would prefer for it not to be changed. So, why did the city choose those areas? they tried to explain it. I think it's the most controversial aspect of the whole thing. There was a lot of pressure from the Fair Share Housing Commission, or the Fair Share Housing Center, this nonprofit, that even if you look at their Wikipedia entry, you'll see even in there that they have questionable ties with developers. So to think that they're these goody two-shoes running around trying to build homes for poor people is there might be an element that's going on, but there's also ties with developers involved there too. They wanted certain things. They wanted a fair share of residential. They wanted a fair share of commercial. They made a lot of demands, and the city tried to push back and balance things as best they could. So they had to give them some things, and then the city next tried to spread it out. And if you do look, I know if you're in one of these zones, it's, well, why my house? Why my condo building? And I understand that. But if you do look, they didn't pick on any particular area, and they did really spread it out. And why did they spare? Because let's face it, there's nothing on Pleasure Avenue, right? Or nothing that I saw on Pleasure Avenue. And there's nothing in the Sacred 70s or the 80s. Well, I mean, back on Landis there in the 80s, but I mean up towards the beach, sort of that golden area where prices are really high. And I gotta say, I think for everyone's interest, though, that's not a terrible thing. I think, my parents bought in the 40s. I've sold houses to people in the 40s or the 30s where if you're going to sell your house, I have to have the conversation, explain to you, your house is not going to get the same amount as some houses in some other areas. And some people decide to make that decision. My family loves going there. We love the convenience of it and walking to the park and all sorts of things like that. But at the same time, it's always been an area the prices have been a little bit lower. I think it helps everyone's interest to protect the areas that have always done best in Sea Isle, because as their prices have moved up, they've always dragged up the other prices behind them. So, the A+ areas, or the areas that get the highest prices, they need to get to $1 million. They need to get to $1.2 million so that it creates area for the other houses that, were worth $750 to get up to $900. So I think the city did the best they could with a tough situation. I know some people are going to disagree. I don't want to get involved in the politics of it. I mean, if I have a lot to say on politics, I always do, but I don't want to get involved in the politics of it. I hope that I kind of cleared some things up for you. I have spoken to a lot of people. I don't see any questions in the comments section. If anybody does have a question, I'd be more than happy to try to address it based upon what I've heard. And additionally, you can always reach me. My cell is 856-776-6126. It's 856-776-6126. You can email the team at burkeandco@outlook.com. That's Burke, A-N-D, co@outlook.com. Or, Facebook message us as well. So for everybody at Burke & Co., that's Dave Sedlak, Chris McGurk, Justine Harkins, myself, John Burke, the Law and Foster Office in Sea Isle. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, reach out to us. I don't see any in the box right now. And this is actually daunting, this live stuff. I do a lot of video, but this live stuff is daunting. So my voice is a little hoarse. I am going to sign off. Please, if you have any questions, give me a call. Thanks.